Well, I'm really looking forward to talking to one of my friends, Susie Mundy, because it's such a delight that she agreed to be here. A lot of you are very familiar with her already, and I can say that I have known her as long as Zena's been alive, and we need to say no more about that. I've been fortunate to see her unfold into the many creative aspects of her own life, and I'm hoping that she'll talk about that a little bit with us today, and she can tell you more about her achievements as we go along. So thanks for being here, Susie.
Thank you, Jane, for inviting me. This is a real pleasure. I never get to see you in person, but at least we're here on the screen.
I know, we should each have a sandwich, so it'd be like we're having lunch. But I don't know. I think that's just how creative lives.
It is.
So here we are. Anyhow, and when we jump in, it's just like we're there wasn't any break in it. So that's always
right.
So I just want to jump right into it because you've been through some events over the past 18 months or 2 years. You can put the timeline on it that represent one of the things that I think people will enjoy hearing about most where you're concerned, and that is the transitions of your life and the phases that you've been through as a creative person and an artist and a writer and a food critic and all the many hats that you've worn in your lifetime, which is fabulous. And so there's a new transition I think you're in the midst of now. So would you mind just filling in a little bit of background about that for us?
Well, on the kind of creative front of the work that I'm making, I'm moving into making more abstract work, although I haven't given up some of my more narrative kind of themes as well. But and I'm doing much more print on demand fabric rather than hand created surface designed fabric. As though I haven't given that up completely either, but it's all there. And there was a time about 2 months ago where I was really planning on downsizing, started getting rid of things in the studio. We were thinking about moving, and I was going to move into a much smaller studio space. And we traveled to Chile. I came back from Chile. We both looked at the porch and at the view from the studio and said, we're not going anyplace. They can carry me out later, but, at this point. So, it's been a little bit of a time of transition, trying to figure out, which way are we going? And I think anytime that you're trying to sort out the next chapter of your life, it's always one that needs reflection as well as just forging ahead sometimes. One big change is, and I'm now really in my 70s, and part of kind of the switch in media has to do with just physical limitations and how long do I want to stand at a printing table, and what are other ways that I can creatively kind of use the same directions but without as much demands on me. I was also diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, so that has been learning to cope with fatigue levels and just energy stuff. Things change and you don't really necessarily think they're going to, but they're going to. And I think all of us, no matter what our ages are, you kind of have to come to terms as you get older that there's going to be some things that are easier and some things that aren't. But I think in terms of the kind of creative impulse of working in a more abstract fashion, some of that really goes back to my background as a painter. And I started out as an artist and an art major at Trinity University. I was a studio art major and did paintings and large installation kind of work with dyed and flung and splattered stuff, as would befit the world of the late 1960s. But anyway, it's kind of fun to find out that there are digital ways to fling paint that make it a lot easier. So I'm doing some paint flinging on my iPad now.
Cool. That's very cool.
And
all the supply, the other stuff is definitely going away?
No, not really. There are screens that I still really love. I like still using thermofaxes, and so I'll make small ones but I'm not doing big yardage. Really, I'm really working on top of some of the printed fabrics, and I'm still incorporating. I've accumulated in 30 years now of doing work with fabric, it's like I've got more fabric than I'll ever be able to use.
Yeah, I hear you there. Well, so talk about the transition, because I think this is another interesting thing. I mean, we can kick the digital age all we want, and sometimes we do. I suppose when it suits us, we do. But I think that another thing about your work that is interesting, and you know what, I can see, isn't it great when we can see the connections? I can look at what you were doing when you were specifically printing and dyeing fabric, and we were working together more consistently. And I can look at the digital things you're doing now, and it's so clear that your stylistic mark is on them.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that's the hardest and the easiest. With digital work, will do almost anything you want it to do. You know, you're working with tiny bits of digital information and pluses and minuses and zeros and ones, but the more you know about your own design vocabulary and your own creative sort of direction in work, it transfers no matter what media you're using, whether you're doing, you know, paper collages or painting with acrylics or doing a drawing on an iPad. Or using an app that somebody else has designed that you're just kind of filtering things through. If you know what you're looking for, that's the big challenge. It's not so much, you know, learning to use the tools as it is learning to use your own imagination, your own kind of ideology, your own iconography as you work.
That makes sense. And I know you teach that as a class, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the class, but because I want people to be aware of it if they're not, but I'm also thinking about what's it like to teach those kinds of concepts online? I mean, I know what I'd say if somebody asked me. I'm curious about your take on it. You've done a lot of teaching in the classroom on lots of different levels, person to person kind of workshop stuff. How are you finding the online experience?
I really like the online experience in many ways because it allows me right now a lot longer time with a group of people than it does if I'm doing a one-shot kind of workshop, and I'm no longer since I live in the country now, I'm not driving into San Antonio to teach at Southwest School or in another venue that's, you know, a semester long kind of process. So I do online, I find, well, here I've got at least 6 or 7 weeks for me to get to know what they're doing and what direction they're going. And so even though the class is really focused on the technology and, you know, the nuts and bolts of how to use something in a tutorial, this is how this app works, or this is how this particular piece of software is going to interact and how you can get it onto fabric. The thing that's most important is looking at what people post back to me and saying, you know, what I see in your work is this strength or this use of color, or that you seem to be exploring this. And then I try to help match people up to a particular process or workflow that might help them, or just keep encouraging that throughout the course. Saying what you need to do is don't just worry too much about mastering this skill, is look at all these tools that are out there and see what's really resonating. You know, what's calling you into it, and what one do you want to keep working on? So.
Cool. And then how would you say that lots of people translate what they do, what they learn from you? Like, are there some interesting ways people are using it that we might not be familiar with? Or do most people still follow the route of using things and having them printed on fabric and stitching and quilting and things?
So far with that, you know, I think I'm still seeing that, although I know that, you know, one of my students who's taken the class several times, Pam Lowe, is doing acrylic paintings, then photographing the acrylic paintings and altering them and putting them back on fabric, which is something that, you know, I'm experimenting with as well. And I think that it's kind of that back and forth between the real thing and the digital image that, to me, seems to have some of the richest sort of material available, you know, the kind of outcome that's really interesting. And there's people that then really take their own particular skills that I don't have any total kind of even interest in grasping, like thread painting or intricate piecing. And then they use those their own particular skill sets with those digital tools.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think interesting and exciting to see. I'm seeing more and more people out there, whether they've taken my class or not, that are suddenly getting beyond just taking a photo and turning it into a kind of a simplified version of it or an image, but who are really looking at, well, you can warp it, you can spin it, you can turn it into a 3D kind of modeled image. You're not just stuck with a photo as a photo. You really can do a lot of just painting, with an iPad without the paint.
Well, yeah, that makes so much sense, because in the early days of all of this, even in the early Spoonflower days, the kinds of designs that people did were not at all as sophisticated as certainly what people are doing now. And the kinds of things that you're doing and the kinds of things that you're teaching people to do. I saw a couple pieces that Pam is working on right now. She shared them with me since she's in this program.
Yeah, right.
And it's exciting. It's exciting what people are doing. So
I think the thing is that one thing about working digitally that one of the questions I think you'd sent me in advance too is, how do you know what to do next, or do you ever get stuck? And one really cool advantage of working with digital images is it's so easy to work with iterations. I mean, you can take one kind of strong design that you really like, or strong composition, or kind of brush mark, and just with seconds have suddenly 20 different versions of that same image to play with. And it really, your eye and your editing ability to match the direction that you want to go in is what's most important, and not particularly the tool.
Well, and I think that's a really great, I used to recommend, and you may have done this for students too, that people get on a practice where they do something every day for 30 days or 2 weeks, or whatever, because it's a great way to train your eye. And I think that the whole digital world has opened up a whole bunch of possibilities for as you say, for these iterations. So you can, in the middle of an afternoon, you can have 30 different ideas, and then each time you're figuring something out, but you don't have to commit to all of them in the way that
In fact, the commitment's the hard part. It's like, okay, well, what am I going to do next?
Right.
Which one do I want to spend the hours on making it into something like real in the world?
Exactly. Well, and that brings up another one of my questions that I sent earlier, which is, so do you have kind of a process that you use to focus and go into the studio and center or whatever? And would you mind sharing whatever that is with us? And then I'm curious whether that has changed when it's no longer, this would be a great question to just ask across the board to people. Does that change when you're not walking into the studio per se anymore?
Right.
And you're designing in a whole new way. But it's mainly about how do you get yourself ready to be creative and really focus.
Right. And I think for me, it still starts with the tangible, the real materials. So it's almost as though designing the fabric can become something that I might be doing. Some of the pieces that I'm working on with turning into wall art right now were sketches I made in a jazz club, because I like to listen to music and draw while I'm listening to music. So it's not like that. I almost don't even count that as studio time. It's sort of like when it becomes the real fabric for me is when it's really studio time, or because I really work, and I always have, from the time I was really young. I love collage. To me, it's just an extension of a collage medium. So it's like making instead of just being, having to use the commercial fabrics or the surface design fabrics that I made myself, it's being able to kind of call on a kind of a broader scope of either pieces that are going to be whole cloth kind of basis for this collage work on top of them, or I'm just using those fabrics I design in the same way I'd use any other commercial or service design fabric. It's you know, cutting them up and pasting them together in a new way. But it's the, in terms of getting to the studio for me, and even whether I'm going to play with an app, or I'll admit a lot of that kind of time for me is like at night in bed, sitting in front of the TV, something else is going on. I mean, it's such a kind of fluency sort of process. It's like just making all this stuff, and then you go back and you look at it and you say, well, what's fitting this particular direction I want to go in right now? What series am I working on? You know, and a lot of times I will make boundaries around my work by having a theme, or wanting to explore a topic like Big Bend or the natural world, or pomegranates, or, you know, it's almost irrelevant what it is, other than it's something that's interesting to me and something I like and something I want to play with that image. But then when I get all those digital images together and pick out a few to have printed, then when I get to the studio and start cutting and pasting and redoing it, it's really very similar to using any other piece of fabric. And the way I get to that stage is still pretty much the same. My really only routine is that on days when I'm home, when there's not a doctor's appointment or somebody crying on the other side of the world that needs help, I will say, I go to the studio first thing. I do not waste my time in the morning on anything else. That's sacred. I try to set up my appointments for the afternoon. I try to set up my errands. Living 45 minutes from the city now makes me very conscious of travel time. You know, I don't do anything without it taking me 3 hours. So, you know, it really all has to be ganged together. So when I have time in the studio, the best thing for me to do is finish, you know, my yoga and writing in the morning, and then head to the studio and put my hands into the sewing machine or fusing or whatever it is that seems to be next on the design table.
Well, I think it's interesting that when you're talking about working at night on the iPad and watching TV, and in a way that sounds like a distracting thing, but on the other hand, the way you were describing it, it almost sounded like a stream of consciousness that's a visual thing.
Yeah, it is. And part of it is that I know the tools that I like to use digitally. And although I explore a lot of other ones for classes, and so I have a big vocabulary of possibilities out there for people that take my classes, the ones that I know I'm going to work on, it's kind of a sketchbook process in a way. It's more like you're doing lots of sketching and playing and fiddling around and changing an image here and there. And then the intention of what I want to physically create in the world out there that's beyond a digital image is going to limit, my choices and give me a direction to go. But, and I still use deadlines and group shows. And the reason I enter them is it gives me a parameter, because otherwise I don't think I'm very good at setting myself to, getting to that step of making something real.
I wouldn't have thought that. Actually, that was my next question, is whether you've ever had a dry spell in your life.
I don't think so. I don't really have a dry spell, but there are times when I take vacations. Yes, it's like I think I've always got ideas that I want to work on, but it's the thing that gets me from the idea into the action sometimes takes a little more nudging. And part of that is for me, is the process of saying, well, this sounds like an interesting thing to try to accomplish. Or, sometimes it is that I'll apply for an exhibit or set myself up with a challenge and say, I gotta produce now. There's no way around it. The deadline is sitting out there.
Well, we need full circle sometimes in order to make it. Yeah. Everything you said. So as a teacher, what do you tell people when they say they're stuck?
Usually what I tell them is to look back at the things they've done that they really like and say, what about this was satisfying? You know, what about this work that you did in the past was satisfying? Was it the theme? Was it the idea? Was it the medium? Was it how your hands had to work on it? Was it a particular kind of energy, or your own kind of approach to sitting there and working slowly or working quickly, and then try to take that feeling and take it to the next step. So, you know, what have you done in the past that worked? And what's a little bit of or piece that you could do? And mainly the other thing is that I think people get really tied up with perfectionism and thinking it's got to be perfect. I'm going to make this great thing, and I've got to have all the skills lined up. And I'm really a jump in and start playing with the materials. So, you know, I really say just get your hands on it, whether it's a digital tool or real life. You know, go buy some crayons. You don't have to do much. And I do, though, recommend that you have a dedicated space that you don't have to clean up every time. I think that's hard for people. I think we who are have the luxury of studios forget sometimes that people are working within the context of, you know, their dining room table. And, you know, I'll say, you know, get yourself a suitcase that you can put everything in and easily bring it out. But if you're having to travel around the house looking for the scissors and looking for the paper and looking for the paste, you know, you're never going to get started. You know, it just takes too much energy and time, and it's so much easier to turn on Netflix.
Yeah. Or go, well, maybe not go for lunch. Maybe that's a good thing about living.
We could go to lunch.
Well, I know sometimes when I don't want to work, I end up at the Indian restaurant and I'm sitting there by myself and I'm thinking, how did this happen?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let me look at my list here. So how do you describe yourself as an artist, and has that changed? What do you call yourself?
I try to just call myself an artist, but and then if people go, well, what kind of art? And I'll say textile art, and they'll look blankly, and I'll say, well, I make paintings for the wall, but they're made out of cloth. I have to admit, I don't use the quilt word if I can avoid it, because immediately, I mean, number one, you're just going to set yourself up for, oh, my grandmother made quilts, and it's like not the right image I'm trying to put out there.
No, I agree.
But on the other hand, you know, I do work in the quilt medium. I'm certainly making art quilts, and for people who know what art quilts are, I'll certainly call myself, I make art quilts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with targeting the language based on who the audience is.
Yeah, right.
Talking to. I mean, I think that's self-care, frankly.
Yes. Yeah, because you could just get yourself into a little bit too many. Oh, do I have to talk about blankets? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I hear you. Well, I think on my list of things that I usually want to find out about people, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is whether or not there's anything that you think about where creativity is concerned, or that wasn't really covered in the kinds of discussions that I suggested that we have, that you think it's important for people to know, either something that's important to you as an artist, or something that maybe as a teacher, I think we discover things that we want to impart to students. But is there anything that you think we don't think about often enough or talk about enough?
I think we as artists really need to realize that we're up against a huge cultural force of consumerism, and that we can, I believe, as creators, and I think really co-creators of the world and the universe, that it's whether somebody's going to create with making a nice table, or, you know, experimenting with something homemade they put on the table, or even the way they put their clothing together. all of that really needs to be encouraged, because it is so easy to get, and easier than ever, to sit down at your screen. You don't even have to leave home to buy stuff anymore. And even as artists, it is so tempting to look at the next new, what's the new gadget, what's the new material, what's the, this particular kind of medium. And it's not that you shouldn't take some time to play around with some of that stuff, but it's really easy to think that if I just buy my way into, the perfect life, I'll be happy. And I think really the only thing that makes us as human beings happy is that when we honor ourselves as creators and makers, because that's what we've been since we were, woke up on this planet and evolved into the kind of human beings that we are. It's like people who talk about eating clean and going back and having your roots, and it's like, yeah, well, the same thing is true of of looking at the way you live your life. How are you making conscious choices about what you're producing, consuming, recycling, using up, not using enough of, and that it's on all of us. It's from both an environmental standpoint, and I think from a psychological and spiritual standpoint.
Yeah, I agree with you about that. I think that we have to be careful not to let our creative impulse be co-opted by the kinds of things that you're describing, so that we're no longer just satisfied to do what we do.
Yeah, and yes, as artists, you and I are both also have to be business women, and we want to sell our products and make a living, and but to do it in an honorable fashion, I think it's really important, and to give value for what we impart, and not expect people to just follow lockstep in our footsteps, but to take their own inner visions and find ways to make it really meaningful. Because if you just spend your life copying somebody that you think's a great artist, you're really not going to get very far with your own soul.
No, and it is soul work, isn't it? Cool.
For sure.
Well, I don't even know that I could add anything beyond that. That's a beautiful
to go. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Well, yeah, I'm very grateful, and I know that people will check out your website and your work and all of that, and I hope you're open to emails and questions if people have it. And
anything I can do, and that I don't have the 10-point kind of rubric, other than just get in there and get your hands dirty.
Yeah. Well, I'm not really looking for formulas at this point.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in real people than I am anybody who's sort of functioning with a formula, because it's only a matter of time before it breaks down.
That's right.
And
thank you.
Being creative means you figure out what you're going to do when the formula stops working.
Right. And then your hands give out or whatever. So there you have it.
Well, I'm very glad you took time to talk to us today, and I'm going to now turn off the recording part of it.
Okay.
That will have been the end, and we can still talk for a minute.
Okay.